Welcome to the very first episode of Fabric of Folklore. I'm your host, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and I am honored that you are here with us today. We will be attempting in this podcast to better understand the folktales, legends, and myths, and how they influence culture and how culture influenced those stories. So yes, in this podcast, we will tell stories, but it will go beyond storytelling. We're going to be asking questions that get at the heart of folklore and all of folklore. So yes, the tales, but also the music, the art, and the traditions that weave a culture together. And today, in this very first episode, we are starting off with a bang because our very first guest is absolutely stellar. You're absolutely going to love her. Her name is Lise Lunge-Larson. Is that correct?
Lunge-Larson.
Sorry, that's right. Lise Lunge-Larson. She's an award-winning author and a professional storyteller specializing in folklore of trolls and Norway, where she was born and raised. Today, she lives in Duluth, Minnesota. And so thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm very honored and happy to be here.
Well, okay, so let's start a little bit with your childhood in Norway and what that looked like and how it kind of influenced your future profession.
Oh, yeah. I kind of grew up in a very storytelling family. So, and stories about trolls and other things that go bump in the night was a big, huge part of my childhood. When my brother and I were fairly young, we shared a bedroom. We had bunk beds. And quite frequently after the lights were off, my father, who was very tall, 6'3", he would just fill out his frame with, all kinds of cushions and pillows. And then he would come charging into our bedroom. He'd say, I smell the smell of human children. Is there any small children I can eat up here? And we would go like, ah! And then we'd have to think of, ways to trick him, to get him out of there by turning a flashlight on him or something that would, cause the troll to explode.
And he would stay in character the whole time while y'all were...
Yeah. And then he would go, ah! When we turn on the light or the flashlight. Or, I remember my first encounter with a troll was when I was 3 years old. And I was walking with my mom in the woods. My dad was fishing in this lake and we were walking. And it was just, it was one of those dense forests with just the light just filtering through. And suddenly my mother took me by the shoulder and said, Lisa, look, there's a troll. And I was like, oh no, I'm going to die until I saw that it was a dead troll. And so an overturned tree root. So, when trolls die of old age, they don't turn to stone. They begin to shrink and they get smaller and smaller, kind of like people do, and stiff.
Uh-huh.
And then the dirt builds up all over him, and then trees and shrubs begin to grow, and creepy crawlies. And as they get stiffer and stiffer and stiffer, they stop walking more than once a day, and then once a week, and then once a month, and once a year, and then they just petrify. And they look like old overturned tree roots. And that's what my mother was pointing at. So it was a dead troll.
Oh my goodness. So, but what is it that makes those petrified? I mean, is it actually a petrified tree root that people are seeing?
I think they're actually seeing ancient tree roots, but I wish I could show you my collection of dead trolls in the Minnesota's boundary water, because I have some awesome pictures of trolls that died that way.
Well, you can definitely send those to us and we'll put them up on the website.
Yeah, when my husband comes home, because he's got them all in a file. But yeah, definitely lots and lots of dead trolls that have turned into tree roots.
Oh my goodness!
Or what looks like.
So, do you think that is where people started coming up with the idea of trolls? Well,
so trolls are part of Norwegian, mythology. So in Norse mythology, which is the sort of the religion, you could say, of the Vikings and of the Teutonics, of Germans too. And, the very, very first thing when the world came into being, the first thing that rose out of this huge gap called Ginnunga Gap was a frost giant. And it was this enormous, huge creature. And then out of his armpit and from between his toes came the race of the trolls. And the first one was an enormous, he grew to this huge size, and it had 6 heads, and it had 6 arms, 3 on each side, and it was ferocious. And ever since that time, Norway has been peopled by trolls. The humans came much later. So the first thing, Ymir, it's a long story about Ymir, who then was later slain by the gods. And then they took Ymir's body. And
Ymir is the first troll?
Yeah, he was a frost giant.
Frost giant. Okay.
And they created the world from him. So, they used his skull to create the dome of the sky, and they took his blood and turned it into water and lakes and oceans, and his hair became, the trees and the grass, and his bones became rocks and boulders, and his teeth and his brains became the clouds.
Oh my gosh.
So really, when you're walking around in Norway, you are walking on dead trolls, because, when the sun shines on a troll, so they're of the landscape, and then they return to the landscape when they die. And so when the sun shines on a troll, he explodes, or he turns to rock. So if you go to Norway, which I think you should,
definitely,
you will be going to places that are called things like, the Trollveggen. I was there this summer. The troll wall, these mountain wall is a troll wall, and the troll peaks and the troll caps and the troll ladder. There's one famous one called Trolltunga, the troll tongue, and it's a huge mountain with this troll tongue sticking right out, like a stone, and it looks like a troll's tongue. So, all over Norway, there's all these mountains. Like Jotunheimen is named the Jotun, it's a mountain range, and it's named after a certain kind of troll called the Jotuns that you see in Norse mythology. And then there's Dovregubben was, the king of the trolls. That's another mountain. So you can be walking on dead trolls.
And so tell us about the king of the trolls.
Well, the king of the trolls, Dovregubben, we don't have a lot of stories about him. He apparently lived to be really, really ancient. And there's stories about him sitting on a rock wondering how old he is,
Because he's so old.
He's so old, and, they might get very old, but they're not very smart. That's the thing about trolls.
You can always trick them.
You can always trick them. Their brains are super slow. They're only about the size of a walnut. Mm-hmm. So even though they're big and scary, if you just don't lose your cool, if you can just use your brain, you can help the troll for sure.
Oh, that's good.
Even a priest.
That's really good. So, you said that the Vikings were the ones who came up with these creation myths?
Well, these stories are pre-Viking, So these are from, I don't think anybody knows exactly when they came from, but they were written down. They invented the runic script, mm-hmm. and so they were written down. And we have the stories, the Norse mythology stories collected in various collections, and you see references to them in the saga literature from Iceland. And then you see a lot of them also in the art. When Christianity came to Norway, those stories were forbidden.
Oh, interesting.
And so the Viking, the stories, about the gods, about Thor and mm-hmm. Odin and the Jotuns and the trolls and all of this, that was forbidden. But the artwork that accompanied these stories was not forbidden. So you can find these early churches, and they still have, paintings of Odin and Thor and of dragons and things like that. It's very interesting. And then there's a lot of scholars that think that even though the stories were not, these myths were not allowed to be told, they just transmuted and changed shape and became the folktales.
Okay.
So there's a character in Norwegian folklore called Askeladden, which is the ash lad, and that the god Thor became this ash lad. Because, Thor, red hair, right. Big beard, not the brainiest, he seems a little bumbling also, but he was the protector. He's the one who protected the humans from the trolls. Mm-hmm. Is one of his big jobs. And so in the folktales with the ash lad, the ash lad always ends up outwitting the troll. So, it's just the way that this lives
Yeah.
on. Uh, you can't keep a good story
No,
down.
absolutely. And so even after it had been tried to be suppressed by the church, it still had a resurgence later on, or did it just continue um like throughout the ages, and then do you feel like it's stronger today, or what is your feel on that?
No, it's not stronger today. What happened is, of course, that before literacy
Mhm.
spread, the literature that you had was the oral tradition, right? People telling stories to each
Right.
other. And that was a very lively tradition, from, the so-called dark ages through the, Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. But with the Renaissance and all of these changes that came about, more and more people became literate.
Mhm.
And as people became more and more literate, the people that started listening to the stories, the old stories, folktales, were the people who still couldn't read. And,
Mhm.
that was often children. And that's one of the reasons why we think of folktales as something that is for children
Mhm.
or for, but then with the sort of national romantic movement that was born in the
Mhm.
1800s, swept through Europe. Then the whole idea, this sort of romantic idea that the folk, the people who couldn't read and write, that they were the preservers of the true culture,
Mhm.
became this strong, strong sort of motivating force. And that's when the Brothers Grimm in Germany went out and collected. They didn't write the Grimm's fairy
Right.
tales. They collected them oral from, people who told them and wrote them down. And not very many years later, two collectors in Norway named Asbjørnsen, Peter Christian Asbjørnsen and Jørgen Moe, started collecting stories in Norway. And in fact, they wrote these down and published, I think it was in 1848, maybe, the first volume. It became a huge national hit because at that time, Norway had, for 400 years, Norway had been Danish territory.
Okay.
Okay. And then in 1814, after a war with Napoleon, Denmark and Norway was on the losing side and Sweden was on the winning side. So Norway got traded to Sweden as a war settlement. So now we were Swedish, right? But we didn't feel Swedish and we didn't feel Norwegian,
Right.
Danish. So the huge question for Norwegians at that time, the Swedes allowed us to set up an independent government, but we had to have a Swedish king and we had a horrible flag that was Swedish with a little bit of Norwegian in the corner.
Mhm.
They called it herring salad. But when these stories were published, it was just like this visceral thing in the country. It's like, this is who we are. This is who we are. That's not Swedish and not Danish. These folk tales with that wry sense of humor, with these giant trolls that were such a foil for the human. They're all things evil and dark, and humans are plucky, and all of this sort of felt to be the essence of the Norwegian, different from the other Scandinavian countries.
Okay.
So they became so important when they were first published, that as Norway moved away from Denmark and uh, and started to develop all books in Norway had to be in Danish because we were Danish.
Right.
But then when we got to be sort of Sweden, the Swedes weren't quite so after us to become, didn't have a Swedish written
Right.
language. So slowly but surely they began to become more and more and more Norwegian. The three books that were printed first, every time there was an official change in the language, was the Bible, the official book of hymns, and the collection of Norwegian folk tales. So
Wow.
in the you're familiar with the music by Edvard Grieg in the Hall of the Mountain
Oh,
King.
okay. Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes.
The Mountain King is a troll.
Wow. Right. Yes. That's what you were saying.
He wrote that for Henrik Ibsen's play Peer Gynt.
Mhm.
And in this, Peer Gynt's a real rascal. He won't be, but he ends up in a Hall of the Mountain King, and he almost married the Troll King's daughter. And this is when he's being, run around by the trolls. So Ibsen, I think Ibsen said that to write is to sit in judgment of yourself. To live is to battle with trolls.
Oh, that's a great quote. So that song was written for a play?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In Peer Gynt.
And how did it become so widespread? Like, why would an American know that tune? How did it become?
Because it's a great
Yeah,
piece of
it
music.
is.
That's big. I mean, that the music that he wrote for that play is much more famous now than the play
Itself.
is. Although in Norway, that play is very famous.
Interesting.
And that was also from that period when that Norwegian nationalism was born, because we had spent 500 years being either Danish or Swedish, and now we were just finding out who we
Right.
are that's different from, and it's, we're all kind of blonde and blue-eyed and outdoorsy.
Right.
So it's hard to tell us.
So would you say that trolls are really the creature that differentiates you in terms of folk tales from the Danish and the Swedish, or are there other folk creatures that might also take that on?
I think that the Norwegian troll is very much sort of like almost like a symbol of Norway, and not in Sweden and not in Denmark. Denmark is very oriented around Hans Christian Andersen stories with the Little Mermaid,
Right.
The Snow Queen. Those are called literary folk tales because they sprang from his mind, not from the collective, oral tradition.
Oh, okay. I did not realize that. I thought he was also a folklorist.
No, he was not. He was inspired by the stories that he heard, but they're really, if you read them, there's a really different tone. It's very, very different. You can tell they have an author, that they're not just written down.
Right.
Yeah. So, and Sweden has a rich, history of stories, but they are not as well known. Again, it's like people are maybe familiar with the Tomten, the Astrid Lindgren story about that, which is about the little gnome. And
I don't know the story.
But your little child in a few years will really like it.
Well, why don't you give us a little taste of it? Can you give us a shortened
No,
version?
I can't tell that one because I actually don't remember that one, but I'll tell you. But I was going to say what's funny about the Swedish folklorists. They, the Norwegian folklorists, as well as the Brothers Grimm, they kept this really earthy kind of oral quality that's very immediate. You get very drawn into the story. But the scholars that collected the Swedish stories, they just really insisted on this very pedantic, moralizing tone. And so they wrote them down, but they really made them inaccessible. So they never took off in Sweden in the same way.
Interesting. And Norwegian folktales don't really have the moral attached to each of them?
No, not much. I mean, it's implied, but not, it's an implied moral, but it's not one of those that's hit you over the head.
So, give us an example of one that has an implied moral.
Well, I think almost all of the stories do, in that let's say we go back to the troll stories, right? Or any one of the stories, it's always about say an adolescent hero that encounters a difficulty. Let's say it's the boy who had an eating competition with a troll. In this story, it's the youngest of three brothers, right? And the father's busted his back, and they have to go up and they got to start chopping down the wood and help out the family because they're running out of money. And they're like, no, Dad, you do it. So, they're like, we don't want to go. There are trolls in the woods. And he's like, I battled trolls all the time when I was your age. You can do it. So finally, the first one comes out and, gets his axe. He goes off into the woods and he starts to chop down. And no sooner has he struck the first blow than out of the woods comes this troll. I'm going to kill you and eat you up. He gets so scared. He runs home and cries to his mom and dad. And his dad's like, oh, you're such a chicken, Anyone could have tricked that troll. When I was your age, I did it all the time. So he's very ashamed. And then the second brother has to go on. And he has the same fate, runs right back down. So the third one, the Ash lad, it's his turn. And they tease him. They're like, the only thing you're good for is sitting around poking in the ashes. You think you're going to be able to deal with a troll? Anyway, he doesn't pay attention. He just asks his mom for some food. So she gives him this big, juicy cheese curd, which he put in his backpack, puts on his pack, gets his axe, off he goes to the forest, puts his sack down, and gets his axe ready, and it starts to chop. Whap! He has no sooner struck that first blow, and again out of the woods comes that great big huge troll, screaming and roaring, "If you're cutting down my trees, I'm going to kill you and eat you up." But this boy's not so slow. He goes over to his backpack, he gets out this cheese curd, and he holds it up, squeezing it, saying, "If you don't watch it, I'm going to squeeze you the way I'm squeezing the water out of this white rock I have here." "Oh," says the troll. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were so strong. Oh my goodness. Listen, if you will not squeeze me like that, I'll help you chop down the trees." Okay, he says, so that's what they do. They chop down the trees. And then the kind of end of the day, and there's no food at home, and the troll looks at this juicy boy and he says, "Oh, how about it? How about you come to my house and we'll have a bite to eat together?" So he said, "Sure." So they go there, and the troll says, "Well, I'm going to make up a fire. You go out to the well and get the bucket and fill it with water, and we'll make porridge." Okay. So he goes outside, but it's not a normal bucket. It's this huge cast iron thing. He can't even lift it. And here the troll, thinking he's so strong, he's like, "Okay." He says to the troll, "Okay, you know what? I'm going to bring the whole well inside. This thimble, it's so tiny. This little bucket you have, let's get the whole well." "No," says the troll, "you can't do that. Just you go inside and make the fire. I'll go and get the water." So they do that. Sit down, and then he makes the porridge. And before he sits down to eat, the boy looks at the troll and he says, "How about it? What if you and I have an eating competition?" Says the troll. So he agrees, because he's like, "I'm 10 times bigger." But before the ash lad sits down, he takes his backpack and he ties it around his stomach. And then he sits down to eat. And then after a while, instead of putting the food in his mouth, he puts it in his backpack. The backpack, he got his knife out and he slices a hole in the sack, and the food runs out and he can keep pulling it. But the troll, he can't figure out what's going on at all, because he's not very smart. And finally, he's really full, and he says, "I don't get it. How can you eat so much? You're so little." He says, "Well, it's very easy. I just, got my knife out and I put a hole in my stomach, and this way I could eat as much as I want." "Oh, that's a really good idea. Didn't that hurt?" "No, not to speak of, not for a big guy like you." So the troll gets his knife out and he puts it to his stomach and he rips a hole in it. And of course, he couldn't survive that. He falls over onto the ground, dead as a doornail. And the ash lad is safe, and he runs inside. He gets all the gold and silver he can carry that the troll has been hoarding, and brings it home to his mom and dad. And with that, they live in the greatest of happiness and wealth to the end of their days. Og är äventyret ute. So there doesn't appear to be a moral on there, but it's clearly, if you start to think about it, it's like, don't give up. Don't listen to people who put you down. Don't be frightened. Use your smarts, and you'll do okay. I mean, the stories are always like that. It's always over and over again. You learn just all these implied lessons about many. This one doesn't have, but in many stories, it's like there might be the boy who goes out to do the thing, but it's very often a princess who uses her brain and helps him solve the problems.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I don't feel like we have that in our culture very much at all.
Did you get this one?
No. What is that one called?
That's The Troll with No Heart in His Body and Other Tales of Trolls from Norway.
I think that one might be the one on hold at the library.
Oh, yeah. That's got some great troll stories. It's got that story in there. That was a little long. Sorry.
No, I mean, I loved it. I was definitely enthralled.
So, it's got all these implied things about, be persistent, don't give up, work with your friends, be kind, it has a lot of implied values that are not, as it doesn't hammer you over the head. What it is, it's just always a great story to listen to.
Exactly. And it reminded me of the Billy Goat Gruff story a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a
Yep.
longer version of that one, but three brothers in that one as well, and they're all tricking a troll at the same time.
That's right. That's right. That's like one of my favorite stories of all
Oh,
time.
is it?
And that
I
yeah,
I did
yeah.
not realize it was from Norway. I didn't.
Oh,
Because I grew up with
yeah.
that one, and my kids and I
Okay.
will play. We have a little bridge that is near one of our walks, and I'll go under the bridge and play the troll, and the kids will walk over the bridge and pretend to be the goats, and they just love that.
That's awesome. That's exactly how I grew up. You were asking me, and I was gonna say, whenever you went hiking, which is like what you had to do on
Uh huh.
Sundays, if there was a bridge and there were some, it wouldn't even be your family, it could be some total strangers who see that a family with kids are coming, and they would hide underneath the bridge. And when you came, it was like, who's stepping over my
Uh
bridge? And you'll go, oh, it's only me.
huh.
Yes.
Okay, so when I was looking at your website, I saw that you had a lot of different quotes that were listed on there, and one of them was you had several from G.K. Chesterton.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll just read it real quick. Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten.
Yeah,
Can
exactly.
you tell us a little bit more about why you love this quote or why you've listed it?
Oh, yeah, dragons, trolls, things, that's what I think. One reason I think children really love the stories is because they don't try to tell you that there will be no
Hmm.
difficulty. Every story is about difficulty, and it's about meeting something that's really big and
You're right.
scary. And for children, the things that seem maybe like nothing to you are like dragons or trolls to them. It's things like, I remember my youngest son, when he was at the end of first grade, he was the only one who hadn't lost a tooth
Hmm.
yet. And it was like the end of the world. Am I going to be the only one that will never lose a
Hmm.
tooth? You know, will I be able to handle a sleepover at my
Hmm.
friend's house? Because that's scary,
Right.
will I so all of these things are really scary to children, and, when you read them folk tales, what the tales tell them is that, yeah, you will encounter dragons. I had a couple of dragon teachers, let me tell you, growing up that were
Right.
terrifying, and, um, and the stories tell them that you can, and they also give you almost like a blueprint for how to overcome that kind of
Right.
challenge, that kind of difficulty. And that's what, that quote is about. It could be about dragons, it could be about trolls, but it's
Or
about
dragon
that
teachers.
big, about
Dragon
what?
teachers.
Oh, oof. Yeah. I'm getting the light in here. Are you seeing me
I,
okay? Should
I'm
I
seeing you
just,
okay. Yeah, yeah, it's okay.
I'm just seeing that.
Oh, there
Good.
we
Now it
go.
can be better.
The sunlight's coming right in. Yeah, it's beautiful. So you had several quotes from this gentleman, G.K. Chesterton. Was he a folklorist or someone who wrote folk stories?
I can't even remember anymore. I hate to admit to tell you. I would have to Google him and look him up. He was famous. My favorite quotes are the one from Einstein,
Okay.
who
Do you
said,
have one?
if you who, well, because Einstein, yeah, what he said was, if you want smart children, read them fairy
Hmm.
tales.
Yeah.
If you want even smarter children, read them even more fairy
Right.
tales. And it's because, the fairy tales describe the world using the imagination. I mean, there are many, many ways to describe the world, right? You could describe it, historically with events that have happened throughout history, or you could describe it
Right.
mathematically or through science. And using folk tales, that's another way of describing the world, but you're using the imagination. And it describes a world that mirrors the world the way children experience it. Because small children, rocks can
Right.
talk, you know, things are
Hmm.
alive. So it mirrors their world, and it functions in a way that makes sense to them. it's also a world where, things, it has a set formula, right? Once upon a time, a long, long time ago. And then it has this rising action,
Mm-hmm.
right? There be a problem. And then they know when they're listening to that story that there's going to be a
Right.
solution to the problem and things are going to end
Mm-hmm.
okay. As they grow up and they are living in a world where they're beginning to realize that things don't always work out okay, they can relax for a
Right.
spell, in that listening to that story, knowing that things are going to be okay. And at the same time, as you're listening to that story, it opens up that world of imagination, especially if you tell a story rather than watch it, because it uses kind of smoke and mirrors. It doesn't tell you what the princess looks like. It just says she's
Right.
beautiful. When the prince might be handsome, but I tell stories to kids from every kind of culture, and they're all imagining the prince or the princess or the hero or heroine as themselves. Nobody gives any color or race, or size or
Yeah.
shape. If you say they have beautiful clothes, they are all imagining it when they're so when you're describing things, they fill it in
Mm-hmm. With their
themselves.
imagination.
Whereas when you watch a movie, it's all been done for them. Everything has been, so as great as these movies are,
Mm-hmm.
you can never see Elsa in any other way than you have seen her in
Right.
Frozen.
Right.
But if you had heard a story, every child would have had a different version of Elsa inside their head,
Mm-hmm.
in one that was more like themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why they're so
Exactly.
satisfying,
Yeah.
that they can put themselves into those stories. And also, a lot of people are like, "Oh, that's such a scary story. How can you tell it?" Of course I do. Well, I do it differently for different
Right.
ages, but but they also, if you aren't too graphic, they will just let their own minds will
Right.
stop where it needs to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And that happen when you see it in video.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
Someone else has decided for them how far it should go, and it's often too much for small
Mm-hmm.
children.
Yeah.
So those are some of the many, many reasons why. The kids are so. I'll give you a really great example, and it's about the Billy Goat's Gruff,
Okay.
of how they live in the story. It was one school, and I was there. It was a whole auditorium. It was kindergarten, first, and second graders. It was probably about 150 kids, and I started out with the three Billy Goat's Gruff. And I'm very sort of like, you're when I'm on an auditorium, it's like when the troll comes, it's like, who's stepping over my bridge? Oh, I'm on my way up to the mountains to get well, I'm gonna come and gobble you up now. Oh, please don't eat me up. Why don't you wait a little while until my brother comes? He's really a lot bigger and fatter than I am. All right, then, roared the troll. So off runs the little goat. Well, I was telling this story when I got to the second billy goat coming across and the troll roaring. This little kindergartner leapt up from the floor, ran across the gym, jumped up onto the auditorium, grabbed my leg, and shouted, I got him! I got him! I've got him!
That's amazing. How brave of that little kid.
Can you believe it? I mean, we had to get the principal to peel him off my leg because he was going to protect that billy goat.
Oh,
He was going to defend
that's
him.
so sweet.
He accessed this amazing amount of courage inside of himself.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you just can't beat that. It was another time I was telling stories, and these were fifth
Uh-huh.
graders, and they were kind of a rough bunch. And the teacher just said, these kids are kind of, this is a tough crowd. This is the last session of the day. If they're bad, just leave. So, I pulled up the best of the troll stories, and I did, and they were just like riveted. It was just like you threw a spell on them. They didn't move. And after I had finished, and I'd done this one story called The Troll with No Heart in His Body, that's like really a great
Uh-huh.
story and appropriate for fifth and sixth graders who think they're too old for
Right.
stories. Um, at the end, there was just dead silence. And then this one little boy stood up, and he was so concerned. He said, So do you think that in the future, like when we might have better weapons and stuff, that we will do a better job getting rid of trolls? And I said, I don't think so, because trolls are evil, and evil is a really old thing in the
Mhm.
world. And you can't use modern weapons to get rid of something that ancient. And we had the best discussion. These fifth graders, they were so insightful, talking about what did you really need to combat evil. And we concluded that you had to be the opposite of a troll. You can't be like a
Yeah.
troll and fight a troll. Have to be its opposite. And that those kids figured that out. You have to draw on the best of what you are.
Wow.
You have to be kind and persistent, and just yeah. It's quite amazing, going around telling stories, because people think kids, they just really get it.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are some other great questions that you've gotten from kids?
Oh, you've read the story about the river
Mhm.
sprite, because of I remember. So the river sprite, for an audience, is a little being that lives in the rivers and often behind waterfalls, and is very, very good at playing the
That's
violin.
one of my kids'
And
favorites,
it's
by the way. That's one of their favorite
yeah.
stories.
So it's you don't usually see these
Mhm.
creatures. They are hidden creatures. But if you it's said that all the best violinists in the world have learned their art, from the river
Mhm.
sprite. And that if you could find a river where a river sprite lived, you would know by hearing, the music. If you come on a Thursday and you bring him a leg of mutton. What's mutton? It's a leg of lamb. Okay. Then it must be a lot of meat on it, because otherwise he will just teach you to pluck. But if it's a good size, he'll teach you to play his instrument.
Mhm.
And one little girl, she goes, and she raised her hand, and she said, I know where there's a river like that. And he said, but does he want the meat cooked or raw?
So she wanted to learn how to play the fiddle.
Yeah. Oh, it's just like, are there descendants of trolls alive today? I mean, they were very astute. That was a long time ago, but I remember one kid saying, "So is Saddam Hussein a troll?"
Interesting.
And we decided he was a
Mhm.
troll. He was definitely a troll, because that's kind of what Ibsen was hinting at when he says to live is to battle with trolls.
Uh-huh.
That that when you let the dark side, when you let the evil, when you start turning towards doing things that are wrong, you're becoming a troll.
Interesting. Yeah,
You know,
yeah, yeah.
when when I was a bad kid, my mother called me a trollunge, a troll kid.
How
you know,
so
there's
one of the stories in Hidden Folk, was about Selkies, and, I had heard about Selkies, through that movie, Song of the Sea, I believe is the movie, um,
yeah,
but I had thought that it originated from Scotland, but I know that there are a lot
yeah.
of those, like, stories that kind of are in different regions as well. Um, do you know if it originated in Norway or where it
No, I do think those are so, the whole Atlantic seaboard kind of shares a shared
Right.
culture and uses different names. So, we all have mermen and mermaids, and there are a lot of, but the Selkie stories are more traditionally told, like in Scotland and Ireland, the Shetland
Mhm.
Islands, and Faroe Islands, which used to belong to Norway,
Okay.
used to be, yeah. So and all of these stories, they're about that liminal space, that in between. They come out in the in between times, at dusk and at dawn. When you're in between, when you're not, one thing and not another. Like maybe you're pregnant, you're not a mother, but you're not a
Right.
mother either. Or you're engaged to be married, you're not married, but you're not
Right.
unmarried either.
Exactly.
Teen- Yeah, and so that's their
Well, can you
time when
tell
they
our
come out.
listeners who aren't familiar with the stories of Selkies a little bit about them?
Well, the story in the book is very long, so I'll just. But the Selkies are come. They look like seals,
Mhm.
but they actually can take their sealskin off. And when they do, they look exactly like
Mm-hmm.
humans, except they're just incredibly beautiful. And, this particular story you're referring to, and almost all of the stories are like
Mm-hmm.
that. It's about a man who sees a Selkie woman and just falls
Mm-hmm.
madly in love. Decides he just has to marry her, so he hides her skin.
And basically
And,
keeps her
she
captive.
what? Say that again?
Basically keeps her captive on Earth.
Yeah, keeps her captive on Earth. So and they have children. And even though, she loves her children, she's a very, very good mother. She always longs for the
Mm-hmm.
sea. And then one day when he goes off, one of her children finds the key to the box where he has hidden her
Uh-huh.
sealskin. And so she's able to get her sealskin back. And so she sits down, with her children and tell them that she has to return to her first family.
Mm-hmm.
They can always come down to the rocks along the seashore. And whenever they need any help, just call for her and she'll come back.
Mm-hmm.
And so she puts her sealskin on and she dives back into the sea. But it's lovely because every Midsummer Night's Eve, she comes back and visits them. And whenever they need anything, uh, she will come back and they get to know their seal brothers and sisters. And there is that sense in these stories, that we are more than we think we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can see that. Okay, so let's go back a little bit to how you got into this line of work and how you felt like it, it called to you.
Well, so I was in Norway and I got something called the Crown Prince Harold Scholarship to go to college in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And that was great, but it was only for a year and I'd fallen in love and I wanted to stay more than a year. So my parents were like, you stay, you pay, because it's free in Norway. And so I got a job at the library at the college where I was in the children's library.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great job because students only came in twice a week, and I needed to read as many children's books as I could to familiarize myself with the collection so I could help the students. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
wow, I'd never read any Dr. Seuss or any, of the American children's books. I was in heaven. It was great. But they didn't have many of the Norwegian stories. And then,
Mm-hmm.
after about a while, it kind of occurred to me that these kids were getting college credit for reading all these books, and I was like, I'm going to do this. So I decided to take that class called children's literature. And when
Uh-huh.
we got to the part, there's always a part that's called folklore and storytelling. The professor
Mm-hmm.
who knew me a little by then said, Lisa, I bet you know a story. Could you tell us a story? And I was like, sure can. And I got up and I told him the Three Billy Goats Gruff. And that
Mm-hmm.
was a big success. And so she told about me to her friend, the professor at the Maine University of Minnesota. And then
Mm-hmm.
I started telling stories in her classroom. So these two professors kind of took care of me a bit. They really sort of look out for me. And there was going to be a big dinner. And a famous Swedish author was coming to give a keynote speak. And people from all over the Twin Cities, like 300 people, librarians, teachers, people interested in children's literature, were coming. And I was invited to be the guest of these two professors so that I could, hear this. So we had this
Mm-hmm.
dinner, and that was very nice. And then somebody came and whispered to one of them, and they two professors started talking together. And suddenly, one of them said, Lisa, have a glass of sherry. So they poured me a glass of sherry, and I was, okay. I didn't really drink
Mm-hmm.
sherry, but I had some sherry. Have another glass of sherry. So I had another.
And sherry's strong, right? It's a lot stronger than wine is.
Yeah,
Isn't that
yes,
right?
and I
Yeah.
wasn't used to it. So I was like super. I'm pretty lively to begin with. And then after that second glass, maybe the third, I don't know, they said, Maria Gripe is stuck in a snowstorm in Chicago and she can't come. But we have all these people here and they're expecting some entertainment. Why don't you tell them stories? And I said, sure. And
That's
that's
amazing.
how my storytelling career was born. I had all these people who all had libraries, with story hours or teachers, and I was a student, so I couldn't receive money. I just worked for dinner. Uh,
That's amazing.
so that's
So, did you see a big difference in the folklore of um were you going to school in Minnesota where you are now?
Yeah, that's where I got. That's
Okay.
how I ended up here. I had a scholarship to go to college.
No, so did you see a lot of difference in the folklore here in America as opposed to Norway?
Well, yeah, because what I was introduced to as American folklore when I came was, the tall tales, with Paul Bunyan,
Oh,
all of
yeah.
those.
Yeah.
Only later did I sort of learn. Well, I learned a lot more about, African American folklore, which is quite amazing, with all the
Mhm.
rare rabbit and the tar baby stories and all of these. And
Mhm.
uh, so, but yeah, and at that time there began to be quite a lot of um, folk tales published with people like Tommy da Paola doing a lot of Italian folk tales.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yeah, clearly nobody had done trolls properly. I mean, there was
Yeah.
you, but it's like they just didn't understand trolls.
Yeah.
But I did storytelling for almost 20 years before I began to write the stories down.
Interesting. And how did you go about doing that research?
Um, my father was an antiquarian, an old and rare book dealer. I grew up in a house that was a bookstore where every book was at least 100 years old or older.
Oh my goodness.
And so I have collected and I found at home many beautiful old, really, really old collections of folk tales. And I also had, I had I actually got a collection of the Norwegian folk tales in English. No, were they English? Well, I got them as a wedding gift from some neighbors who said, "So you won't ever forget your Norwegian trolls." I was not like,
Oh, that's beautiful.
and so I did a lot of reading. I knew tons of stories from having heard them growing up, but then I
Mhm.
started reading a lot of those really old collections with more of the hidden folk stories, which are not so much in the actual Norwegian collections of folk tales. They don't have so many, of the hidden folk, the Nisse, the fairies and elves and gnomes and dwarves. They are in other kinds of collections that didn't really become as popular for reasons I'm not
Interesting.
sure of. They were more they that they were more anecdotal in nature.
Mhm.
So they were often I guess one of the differences is that the folk tales that sort of begin once upon a time, a long, long time ago, they have a certain literary quality to it. And they were always told as entertainment and
Mhm.
not as a literal truth, but as a metaphorical truth. And these stories about the fairies, elves, gnomes, dwarves, selkies, they were always kind of told more like, as an aside, this really happened. This is true. This is
Mhm.
this is not a make believe. This really happened. And so it's a very different quality to them.
And are they still told today to kids in that fashion?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, I remember one time, well, my grandmother was supposed to have met, one of the water horse, Nøkken, he's called in Norwegian. And there was a big
Okay.
cautionary story. And then once the creature that's not in this book is called Huldra. And she's this unearthly, beautiful woman that lives in the mountains and she's just bewitching. And the only way that you can tell that she's not a normal human is that she has a cow's tail, but she hides that underneath her skirts. So it was very dangerous for a man, to walk, over the mountains. The only power that you would have if you had to have a steel knife and you have to throw it over her. If you saw that she had a cow's tail, otherwise, you'd go home with her. But it said, that they did occasionally marry human men, and if she agreed to marry in a church, her cow's tail would fall off and she would lose some of her unearthly beauty, but she is said to be, they were very good mothers and very, very good storytellers. And my kids were little, I used to say, and when I married your dad, I buried my cow's tail on my father's grave. You're kidding right now.
Did you ever go and show them where it was buried? That's too funny.
Yeah, I know. So,
Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
yeah, it's a very different kind of a type of a story.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was growing up, I believed that there was a leprechaun in the attic in our house, and all of the neighborhood kids believed that as well. And I don't know where that even came from, but I mean, kids latch onto those things, and it really sparks the imagination.
It really does. I was just telling that story about that little rascally Nissen to my grandson's class on Thursday, and
Hmm.
they were all like, "I got one of those. I have one that lives in my attic."
Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about that? The niece. How do you say it?
It's pronounced
Nissen.
Nisse in Norwegian,
Uh huh.
and in Swedish they call the exact same creature tomte,
Okay.
Tomte. And sometimes in Danish, they're actually called trolls. And that's why you often have that confusion when people think trolls are small. Because
Okay.
Nisse is little, is only about the size of a
Right.
1 or 2-year-old, so just a small child, even though he lives to be hundreds and hundreds of years old. And in the old days, of course, he lived the farmers who had a Nisse living were very lucky because they took care of all the animals. They loved to brush the horses and the sheep and the goat and the cows and feed them and everything. And so the farmers called them the good folk, or the good.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's not so many farms, so their habitat has diminished, so there's not so many. But some of them have moved into houses in their attics, especially if you have a furry pet. So, the
Oh.
way
Uh-huh.
you can tell if you, because nisses are not extinct the way trolls are extinct. You can find evidence of trolls, and you can find living evidence of the nisse. So they love to dance, and they are nocturnal. So if you hear a lot of creaking from,
Mm-hmm.
attic or the.
I definitely have some.
Yeah, and it's the nisse up and about at night, and he might be practicing his dance move because he's a really good dancer. Or if you have a pet that's really happy and has a very shiny coat, it might be that you have a nisse who helps take care of him. But for those of us in the north there, one of the best ways to know if you have a nisse is if you lose a lot of socks or mittens. And that's because the nisse kind of steals them in order to use it as a sleeping bag for his children,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just the
Mm-hmm.
perfect size.
Mm-hmm.
So the story is about a nisse that lived on a farm, and he was practicing dancing one day, and he was going at it so hard that when he did a big huge somersault, when he landed, crack, he landed with such force that his little leg cut through the floorboard and dangled down into the room below. Well, right then, there was a farmhand named Jack who was busy pitching hay for it. When he saw that, little leg, he thought, "Ha, so our Nissa is up there, that rascal. I'm going to give him a surprise." And so he grabbed his pitchfork and he ran up and he poked the Nissa in the leg with a pitchfork. And the Nissa went, "Ow, ow, ow." And he yanked his leg up and he hopped around. And the Jack, the farmhand, he just thought this was the funniest thing he'd ever seen, the way that little leg disappeared. He was laughing and laughing. He was still laughing when it was supper time. So the farmer said, "Well, Jack, share the joke." Oh, he said, "Our Nissa was dancing so hard today that his leg cut through the floorboard and dangled into the barn below. And boy, did I give him a surprise. I gave him one big jab with a pitchfork." "You didn't just give me one jab. You gave me three jabs because there were three prongs on that pitchfork, and I'm going to get you for it," came an angry little voice from outside. But Jack just laughed. I mean, he was a strapping big 16-year-old. He wasn't going to be afraid of a tiny little creature like that.
Mm-hmm.
He went to bed without a care in the world. But in the middle of the night, that Nissa snuck into the house, down the hall, into Jack's bedroom, and there he grabbed him, lifted him up, and carried him outside. And out there, he grabbed Jack by the legs, and he started to swim him around and around and around, and then he flung him up over the barn, and then he ran so fast to the other side that he caught him before he hit the ground. Then he flung him around and over a second time. And Jack, normally a very sound sleeper, boy, did he wake up. "Help, stop. I'm so sorry for what I did. Please put me down. I'll be really good. I'll never do it again. Just please put me down." But the Nissa was really mad. He just grabbed Jack's leg and he flung him over a third time, four, five, six, seven, eight. Finally, on the ninth time he had let Jack have his way, he flung him up and over the barn so hard that he landed in the middle of a field in a great big brown, smelly mud puddle. Then when he saw Jack sitting there, he laughed so hard that he woke up the whole household. Down came the farmer and his wife and the kids and the dairymaids and all the other people who worked on the farm. And when they saw Jack sitting out there covered in brown muck, they started laughing too. So poor Jack, he learned his lesson the hard way, but learning he did. From that day on, he was really good to the Nissa. And if you have a Nissa at your house, I suggest you be good to him too.
That is such a great story.
You have to end Norwegian stories with snip, snap, snute. Her eventyret ute. It means snip, snap, snout. This tale is told out.
Oh, that's so cute. I love that ending.
Yeah.
So do you think that people would try and go and steal other farmers' Nissas if they didn't have one?
You can't do that. They can't. The thing I didn't mention about the Nissa, but you maybe could deduce, is that even though he's very tiny, he's insanely strong. He is so strong he can lift up an entire horse. So you cannot forcibly move a Nissa. But if you don't take your Nissa seriously, he can leave you and your farm will suffer as a consequence. There's loads of stories about that. And there's loads of other stories where there was like at Christmas, you're supposed to put out porridge for them. Well, every Thursday you should put out porridge. But on Christmas, he expects to have a big lump of butter and some sugar on top. And so this one dairy maid, she put the lump of butter and the sugar in the bottom. So when the Nissa saw his porridge, didn't have it, he was really mad. So when she came in, he grabbed her and he danced and danced and danced, until she wore her shoes out and she almost fell down dead. And then he sat down and he thought, well, he'd eat it after all. And then when he came to the bottom and found the butter, he felt really bad because he had worn her out. So, he restored her to all her, good senses again and, did extra work. But it's kind of like, just don't mess with him. So there's this sort of, live in harmony with the things around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do people still put out porridge?
No. Maybe Icelanders, but not Norwegians. And the Nissa firmly belongs with Christmas in Norway. We don't have Santa's elves. We have Nissa. And the Santa Claus is called Julenisse. So he's the Christmas Nissa.
Oh. I think we've covered quite a bit, haven't we?
Yeah. You didn't get a quiet person.
No, but I'm very grateful for you. Well, do you think is there anything else you want to add?
There's so much you can say, about the stories, about why, I think I'm so glad you're doing this podcast because I think the children just don't get these stories anymore. They get them maybe as a movie, but they don't get the breadth and the depth of the folk tales. And I think it's a real shame because I think it sparks that creativity. It opens up the world. It gives them a respite. It does so many things for children. Even something simple. I have teachers tell me, that kids don't understand the references like, well, if the shoe fits, like with Cinderella, or all of those kinds of references that you often do. And they don't, it's like they don't tell these stories. So I hope that we've had a chance to touch on, why these stories are so important and why parents need to keep sharing these stories. And I think it's, do it with books or just tell it.
Yeah.
Because also, if you get just the really old books, they're quite gruesome. You read the Brothers Grimm and you go, ah,
yes.
You need to you need to adapt. And I was going to say that I do think it's a good thing. What happened when these stories were written down, in the 1800s, they became frozen in print the way people thought and spoke and did things in those days.
Mhm.
Until then, it had been a living oral tradition that changed and adapted with the times, with different
Mhm.
people, with different cultures. So, one of the things that's really fun to do is to take the universal elements, but then imagine, adapt the stories so that they're appropriate for children today. And
Right.
we are different than, we think differently than people did 200 years ago. So it's
Mhm.
appropriate to be inspired by the really old versions, but bring them up into the modern age. I
There's so much value to the folk tales, which is why I wanted to start this podcast. For me, I remember folk tales more than any other stories that were told to me, and so they just stick in my mind. And I just kind of wanted to explore why that was, why they're so memorable, and why they spark so much imagination.
yeah. I have a psychologist friend who says he thinks that when they hear the stories, they just bypass the entire more frontal cortex, the modern brain, and it goes right back down to the ancient part of the brain where they reside right next to fire.
Right next to fire.
Yeah, right? Yeah, because the things that sort of makes humans really humans is, I mean, no other animal makes fire that I know of and sits by the
Mm,
fire and uses fire the way we do. So it's one of those early things, and stories like these belong with, our ancient heritage. It connects you on a very, very deep level with something fundamentally.
mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and there's so many crossovers with so many different cultures. I know that in Japan, they have a very similar Little Mermaid story, and you were saying that it came from Denmark. Is that where you said it originated from?
The Little Mermaid, but that's yes, an original tale by Hans Christian Andersen. But there are
Mhm,
mermaid tales that are folk tales that came out of the oral
mhm.
rather than Hans Christian Andersen's. But I know the Japanese have some amazing underwater tales and things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
I
there's
just love how much crossover there is, even from, like, people from so far away.
yeah, there are more than 500 variants of Cinderella found in Europe alone.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Can
isn't
you
it?
tell us a little bit about the different variants?
Oh, there's so many different variants. My daughter said, I think we had 13 different ones, didn't we, growing up? And there's a really cool African American, and I can't remember it. I'll have to pull it out. But can you guess where they think that story originated? So, what's the
No.
pivotal? Because the pivotal element is, does the shoe fit, right? To have the tiny foot. So, the
Mhm.
culture that emphasized the importance of the tiny feet for women was China.
China?
So they think
Yeah.
that it might have started in China and traveled with peddlers and merchants through the Silk Route and landing, in Europe. And well, along the way,
Interesting.
because there are variants there, I have Egyptian variants, I have a Korean variant. Their variants. It's such a compelling story, and so people
Right.
before literacy was widespread, you brought stories with you. They traveled with people. When the English settled Australia and America, they brought their stories with them, right? Or when people were taken prisoner of war, or when they were enslaved and they brought their stories with them. And
Right.
they pick when you have a really good story, everybody goes, I heard a good story. But
Right.
you change it. So I think the Chinese story has a fish in it rather no, there's no
Oh, interesting.
pumpkin or anything like that. I have a whole bunch of them here.
And they still, I know that the Grimm's tale, when they actually cut their toes off and their heels off,
Yeah,
right? And it's very
it's
very
bloody.
gross, but I mean that's kind of the tradition in China. They don't cut off, but they break bones
Yeah, break
and
bone.
bend.
It's pretty brutal, right?
Oh, God.
There's
I mean, people died.
Yeah, and so, that's how stories, because they are of the oral tradition, they travel with people as they move. And, people have always been on the go, but stories go with you. But if you grew up say, on the ocean, and then you end up in a mountainous place that's very dry, the landscape in the story will change, the clothing, the food, but the basic element of the story stays the
Mm-hmm.
same. So
Mm-hmm.
it is really fun that to study, the different versions of stories from different cultures.
Yeah, definitely. I'm very much looking forward to hearing all the different variants from different places.
Yeah. Oh, you're going to have a great time.
Well,
So,
thank you so much for coming
thank
on. It
you.
was such a pleasure.
What fun. This
And
is really, really fun for me.
yes, and maybe we'll even have you on and have you tell us more stories because you were just such a great storyteller.
Thank you. Yeah.
Um,
Anytime. I've got hundreds of them lined up there.
Oh, great. So thank you, listeners, for joining us today on Fabric of Folklore. I'm really glad you were here. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to tell a friend. And please make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. Also, all the links and information we covered in this podcast will be on our website, fabricoffolklore.com. I may be the host of this podcast, but ultimately, this is y'all's show. We want to hear from you. So we've created a Facebook group so you can tell us your thoughts, give us your suggestions for future guests or topics, and we can see if we can get them on the show. And if we can even give you out a shout out. So we can't wait to see you next week.